El Comite MIP, The Struggle for Social Change, the photographs of Maximo Rafael Colón. Enjoy.
50 years ago, a group of young men and women from the Upper West Side, as Maximo Colón began to describe in his presentation, began doing housing work because there was a movement called urban renewal that was looking to remove working class people from the communities that we had historically inhabited, especially working class people of color. And today you call this gentrification. And today, if you go to 88th Street and Columbus Avenue, which is where we had our office, you would never believe that there was once a group of Latino working class youth organizing, because it is so gentrified and so outside of our reality. But back then, we took over that office and we helped the squatters movement that was up there. And as we began to look at why is this happening? What are the reasons behind this kind of situation? We began to do political education. We began to study. We began to have discussions. It became more and more formal. We had with us not just Puerto Ricans, that was the base of our organization, but we had founders who were Dominicans. We had Cubans. We had Panamanians. So that we had also the influence of other people and of other perspectives, and communities that were similar to ours, but had also gone through their own changes as immigrant communities in this country. From there, as we begin to do this kind of political work, we also begin to understand that it's not just a housing issue. There are other issues happening all over the city. We had the bilingual education struggle in the Lower East Side. I was in the Lower East Side, and I became involved in that struggle with other compañeros who lived there and who were members of El Comite. And we began to struggle for community control of the schools, which had started in Ocean Hill, Brownsville, another working class, predominantly African American community. And so we had that struggle happening. We struggled to stop the closing of hospitals like Harlem Hospital, and to struggle for clinics that were desperately needed in our communities and to stop them from closing. And we struggled for student rights, and we struggled for for Puerto Rican studies programs. We struggled to keep the schools open, the universities open and affordable to working class children, working class students. We struggled to stop the forced drafting into the war, the Vietnam War, of our youth. So there were many things happening at the time. We had a war, a Vietnam War. We had young people from our communities being drafted, young men being drafted and coming back damaged in body and soul with no resources, nothing to help them get over the war, and being forced then for communities that were already stretched thin to try to help our own Vietnam veterans. We also then had Vietnam veterans who helped to come back with that outrage, that fire, and helped to create the political organizations like El Comite, like the Black Panthers, like organizations of Mexican Americans, Chicanos, indigenous organizations. Almost every major political organization of that time, especially of communities of color, had Vietnam veterans in there. And that's an aspect that I don't think gets mentioned often, of the work that they did in helping to create consciousness around the US as an imperial power and what it was doing to the people of Vietnam, and from there, what it was doing around the world and who was behind that war. So all of this was happening at that time. At the same time, there was a women's movement that was emerging, right? And they were struggling for abortion rights. They had been struggling for birth control. And we, the Latinas who were part of that struggle, also began to see that we had to struggle against sterilization abuse that was happening to Puerto Rican women, to African American and indigenous women. And so it wasn't just birth control and abortion rights. In our particular case, it was also sterilization abuse, because we learned as part of our history that by that time, 30% of Puerto Rican women of childbearing age had been sterilized. And so many things influenced us, so many things fed us, so many things outraged us. And so we deepened our political education. We were influenced by the struggles in Chile. We were influenced by the struggles in Nicaragua. We were influenced by the struggles in Argentina. We were influenced by the struggles of all of these different compañeros and compañeras and liberation movements around Latin America. But we were also influenced by struggles in Africa. We learned about Nelson Mandela in South Africa. We learned about Angola and the MPLA, right? we learned more and more about who the Vietnamese people were and why this war was happening. And we became convinced that these were people that we had to defend and that we had to struggle for, and that we had to sustain a movement here in this country to end the war, but also to support the right of the Vietnamese people to develop the society that they wanted. We also did solidarity work with Cuba. Puerto Rico and Cuba had always been close, but now we became close to the Cuban Revolution. We learned about the blockade against Cuba. We learned about what the revolution was trying to do in Cuba and bringing about. And so defending the Cuban Revolution became essential also to our work. And throughout it all, from the beginning to the very end, the struggle in support of Puerto Rico's right to independence, the struggle against the colonial nature of Puerto Rico, and exposing what was happening in Puerto Rico. And that was why we were here, understanding that we were here because Puerto Rico's a colony, and that we had to defend Puerto Rico and support the revolutionary forces in Puerto Rico and the mass struggles of Puerto Rico, the struggles of the students of Puerto Rico in the University of Puerto Rico, the struggles of people who were struggling for housing rights, people who were struggling against repression in Puerto Rico, because every time the people mobilized in Puerto Rico, the state would come down with massive repression over there. At the same time, we were struggling to liberate our political prisoners. Lolita Lebrón, Rafael Cancel Miranda, Irving Flores, Andrés Figueroa Cordero, Oscar Collazo. They have been in prison since 1950 in the case of Oscar Collazo, and the other four since 1954. And so we struggled to get them out of jail. And that in itself was a major education, because not only did we learn about the Puerto Rican comrades, we learned about the Black Panther comrades who have been in prison, and to this day, 44 years later, are still in prison. We learned about Leonard Peltier, indigenous comrade, who to this day is still in prison. So these were the things that outraged us, that fueled us, that informed us, that educated us, that motivated us, that inspired us. And so today, we celebrate that history with a photographic exhibit that Maximo Colon prepared, and that shows not just the specifics of El Comite, but more so the era of El Comite, the era that we were in, the different communities and what was happening in those communities, and the ways in which those communities were struggling, but also what was happening there in terms of the impoverishment of those communities, the devastation of those communities. That is what this exhibit, we hope, will give you a taste of our work, but a taste also of that era. I want to end by saying El Comite MINP is no longer around. We lasted for about 12 years. Like many groups, we had internal issues, but we were not the only ones. It was an era where there were different issues everywhere. The Young Lords were no longer around. PSP was having issues. We had, within the white left, there were different issues. We had participated to the event to the extent that we could in trying to build a revolutionary movement in this country. But we were also up against powerful forces. And so El Comite MINP eventually ceased to exist as a political organization. But El Comite MINP, as a commitment, continues to live in those of us who are still here. We continue to stand for Puerto Rico. We continue to demand, we continue to be outraged by the fact that Puerto Rico is a colony of this country. And we continue to march and defend the right of Puerto Rico to be free. We continue to be outraged by the political prisoners that I just mentioned earlier, and the fact that they're still in prison, and we continue to fight and demand their freedom. We are still outraged by the fact that they tried to legislate our wombs as women, as we are seeing in Texas. It outraged us then, it continues to outrage us today. We are outraged by what is happening with immigrants in this country, and the caging of children, right? And the deportation of the Haitian people. We are outraged by the terrible, terrible destruction of our earth that is putting in danger the future of humanity all over the world, in this country and all over the world. We are outraged and continue to be outraged by the racism and police brutality that continues to be used against people of color, particularly the African American community. At the same time, we feel gratified and inspired by the young people that are out there today with new tactics of struggle, with new forms of struggle, new ways of mobilizing us, of fueling us, and telling us we need to continue to struggle. The struggle has not ended. And though some of us no longer can move as quickly as we once did, right? We can't move as fast as we once did. We can't always be at every demo. We can't always be at every event. But we continue to make every effort to be presente. We continue to be presente. In whatever way we can. If not a demo, then surely we're going on Zoom to find out what's happening around the world. We're digging into our pockets, our retirement pockets, and saying, here, I support the struggle, right? We are signing petitions that are put before us, denouncing or supporting something or the other. We are determined still to alert and demand and denounce elected officials that are not representing the interests of our communities. So we have not gone away. We've gotten older, our hairs are grayer, but we have not gone away. And we will not go away because that is the legacy of El Comite. It lit a fire in us and that fire has not been put out. And we will continue to say presente in every way that we can. I end now, before I introduce Maximo, with a consigna, a slogan that we used back then. In English, it's death and war to imperialism. In Spanish, it was guerra y muerte
al imperialismo.
Guerra y muerte
Al imperialismo.
Guerra y muerte
Al imperialismo.
Thank you so much, compañeros. Thank you. I now leave you with Maximo Colon, our photographer, who will explain some of the photos that are up there. Maximo continues to have an eye and a focus and a commitment on documenting, not just El Comite back then, but on documenting whatever struggle is happening here and around the world. Maximo.
Hay mucha historia en esta fotografía, muchas experiencias que tuvimos como organización y quiero decir enfáticamente que todo esto, ¿verdad?, fue a base de coalitions, ¿verdad? No podemos decir que nosotros hicimos la revolución. Y es muy importante para la gente joven que oigan eso y que aprendan de eso, la cuestión de, mobilize together. And I'm very happy that People's Forum exists because something like this did, we had something close to it, which was Casa de las Americas back then. And I was here yesterday putting up the show with the rest of the committee. And there's this flurry of activity of all young people. It just gives me hope, There were very important things that happened that I got to experience, as a member of the Comite. One of the first things was when, back in 1972, when I went with Federico to Puerto Rico to talk to the Nationalist Party on behalf of the organizations here that were advocating for the release of the nationalist prisoners, which was, PCP, the Carlos Feliciano Defense Committee, Los Estudiantes. I mean, it's a whole series of organizations, Resistencia Puertorriqueña, and Fred couldn't drive. He didn't know how to drive. He was a former Marine. He had a lot of experience, but he couldn't handle a car. So, Dominicano. So I went with him, as a backup and also, chauffeuring him around. And we met with the nationalists. And one of the photograph is not here, but one of the highlights of that trip was meeting Blanca Canales. And we were at that time in the early 70s. We were very nationalistic. We were like down with Don Pedro and the nationalists, I mean. So we had a lot of experience with that. One of the other things that happened that the pictures, talk about was the whole question of how we organize with other people for the creation of realidades. And when we challenged Channel 13 and PBS, for representation of our community, and we said, you receive X amount of public funding, yet you have zero programming that represents our community. And again, that was through a whole series of people that were involved, and one of the highlights of that was when we were covering the UN back in '72, and we got a chance to try to interview Salvador Allende. And unfortunately, through problems, we couldn't meet with him, but we met with his wife, Hortensia Allende. And we met with her at the Wall of Astoria. Federico was part of that interviewing process. And this was for a segment on realidades. So when we left, we were loading up our equipment in the Wall of Astoria, in the docking area. I noticed through the revolving door, I see some activity. And I noticed Salvador Allende is coming through the revolving door. So right away, I started taking pictures as they were in the revolving door. And as they approach, and that's maybe the picture you'll see upstairs, and as they approach, Doña Hortensia said to Salvador Allende, he said, mire, Salvador, estos son unos compañeros que apoyan la lucha en Chile. So, he came over, we shook hands, and, we said our words. So that was a real important moment. And it's all, the gains that our community have made have been through struggle. It's not because they were given to us because, the powers that be felt benevolent and said, oh, let's give them this or let's give them that. It was on the base of struggle. I remember as a young person, 13, 14, and the neighbors would ask my mother if I could go with them to a social service agency so that I could translate. And you can imagine, I just got here. I didn't know all the nuances of the language. I'm getting better. But anyway, the photographs are here. It's a whole lot of different struggles, and it was with a lot of compañeros and compañeras, that this came about. And, I want to remember, Manuel Ortiz, who was a hell of an organizer. Iris Belgara, Noel Colon, there's a photograph of him and his child. Noel Colon was assassinated, was murdered in his office at the Union Hall in Puerto Rico. Was one of our comrades at El Comite. Federico Lora, who recently passed away. And if I forgot somebody, Nelson Gomez Soto. And these, we were a little younger than some of the folks that were in the Comite. They were a little older than us. They had a lot more experience, Lillian and I, and Willie, who's sitting back here, we were all, rebel-rousing the Manhattan community. And eventually we migrated to El Comite. So there's a lot of history. And I want to thank the People's Forum for hosting, the presentation. If you can donate, keep this going because this is a very important space. And I want to thank, my compañeros because las cosas no se hacen sola,
Gracias, Maximo. I just have a public service announcement. We have a book that was written by one of our members, Rose Muzio, Radical Imagination, Radical Humanity, Puerto Rican Political Activism in New York. If you get a chance to, please look at this. This will give you more of an in-depth understanding of El Comite from the beginning to the end and goes into more details about some of the struggles that I mentioned and that Maximo mentioned. This exhibit will be up until November 12th. It begins here, and then you have to go upstairs. We're going to have Biding and Kathy will be helping to direct the traffic. The pictures are on both sides of the wall upstairs, and it's a narrow hall. So we ask people to please be careful. That's glass. And so, you might be looking at something, suddenly lean back and hit something behind you. So please be careful. The traffic will be directed so that you will come back through another exit. Biting is standing over there, and Kathy Gruber's over here. And so, thank you all. Thank you very much for coming out and supporting us. We'll see you at the next demo.